Hello and welcome to Wine Blast. I'm Susie Barry. With me is my husband and fellow master of wine, Peter Richards. So, MW husband, WTAF.
That's a lovely warm introduction and welcome. Thank you. WTAF indeed, because this episode is all about wine in alternative formats AF, like bag-in-box, pouch, cans, plastic bottles, kegs, and how, according to their proponents, they might just help save the planet while enabling you to drink deliciously.
The climate crisis is, of course, a huge focus right now, particularly in the wake of COP26 in Glasgow. And I think we're all asking ourselves, what are we doing to help or hinder in the face of this impending catastrophe? Here's a taster of what's to come.
Nobody would think of the wine industry as a villain in the climate story, and in fact we are.
Now, this is certainly an eye-opening episode, one you definitely want to stick with to the end, as we're going to hear from these alt-formers, format warriors?
Transformers?
Yeah, nice one. Transformers. That brings back a whole set of memories. But we're also going to get a sense of the overview from sustainability charity WRAP, and we're going to recommend a few alt-pack wines as well, delicious ones. Now, most, I think, sensible wine drinkers just want to enjoy their wine and not ruin the planet while they're doing it, But how to make the right choices in that sense, that's what we're going to be diving into.
Absolutely. We should also just quickly explain that WTAF is the acronym for
I'm interested in what you're going to say next.
Well, wine. It's a good start, isn't it? Thank goodness. Yeah. Wine Traders for Alternative Formats. It's a recently formed grouping created to tie in with COP26, and the association with the perhaps better known meaning of that acronym is not a coincidence. Let's not go into it. What it
politely?
Is. No.
Most people know what it means, don't they?
Yeah, I think people do, and I think we all know it deliberately signifies an expression of surprise and shock.
Well, that's very decorously done.
But we're going to come on to that in due course.
Yeah, we are. Okay, so just before we start, though, we've got a couple of things to mention. Firstly, to congratulate once again the winners of our big English wine adventure competition, who won a full set of all three amazing wines. Sally Hitt suggested the Marine Conservation Society for our charity and said when we told her she'd won that she was, and I quote, gobsmacked, over the moon, and very honoured. And she added bravo for choosing the Marine Conservation Society, and here's to raising lots of money. Luke Wolfe, who suggested the name Hope and Glory for our sparkling wines, brilliant name, said he was thrilled. And actually he got the news as he was harvesting grapes, which is very appropriate.
Brilliant. Very, very appropriate. So anyway, we're really excited, as you all know, about our big English wine adventure. The wines go on sale on Thursday, the 25th of November. Check out our website for more details. And all profits will, as we've said, be going to the Marine Conservation Society to help restore our seas and fight climate change. These are amazing, unique English wines, so please help us out and buy.
Yeah, we need your help. Now, following on from this, we'd also like to congratulate Will Nathan, who's won our Wine GB competition from Series 3, Episode 2, when we were talking about the future of English wine. Thank you to everyone who took part in that competition. Sorry for the delayed announcement about all this. We had so many lovely reviews and ratings. Each and every one we massively appreciated, so thank you. But just to read out Will's review that he wrote, he said, "This is how you do a wine podcast. Informal, insightful, practical, full of tips, humour and intel. I can't commend this podcast enough."
We love you, Will. Thank you.
Thank
you,
you,
Will.
Will.
We love you.
Oh, well said. Well said. And he said he was going to take the wines to Australia to show his, and I quote again, wine snob dad what English wine is all about these days. Love that.
Didn't one review tell us we should be swearing more? Going back to what we were WTFing, I think they'd particularly like the episode we did on fake booze, didn't they?
The infamous explicit episode, which it's not us, but they did indeed. And I am not gonna make the obvious riposte to that.
Isn't it WTAF? Surely.
It's not bleepable. But yeah, we also got awarded, if you remember, 100 points by one reviewer. Which I think surely is the pinnacle of any wino's career. We should just retire now.
Was that Robert Parker?
No, it wasn't even Bob. But we'll take the 100 points.
Bob Park.
Uncle Bob. We were encouraged also to keep disagreeing,
which is always good for our marriage. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. I wonder if, yeah, anyway. And then someone said, and I quote, it sounds like they're having fun producing the show for us all to enjoy. And I think that's pretty spot on, isn't it?
It's fair enough.
We do enjoy this. So
We
thank
do
you very
enjoy
much
it
for
far
listening.
too much some of the time, which is why they last so long. Anyway, back to the main business. Wine in alternative formats. We should just mention, we did an episode on glass and glass bottles for wine, which was Series 2, Episode 3, which is well worth a listen in this context if you haven't heard it already. But essentially, alternative formats means everything other than glass bottles for wine. So things like bag-in-box or bib, as they're known, pouches, including bagnums, which probably does what it says on the
Just
tin.
a sort of 1.5
very
litre
large
bag. About 1.5 litre pouch.
Yeah. Flat bottles, paper bottles, which are sort of reshaped bag-in-boxes, kegs and cans.
Yeah. And they've all come to the fore lately, haven't they, with the mounting concern and action being taken over the climate crisis, because their supporters say they are one of the most effective ways of lowering wine's carbon footprint and climate impact, mainly because they take less energy to make or recycle, and they're lighter, crucially, so they take less energy to transport around the place.
Now, much cited are the ALCO studies.
Studies, and that's with a K rather than a C.
ALKO studies by the Finnish alcohol monopoly, which rated the carbon footprints of different types of wine packaging per litre. Now, traditional glass bottles, which weigh about 540 grams, had emissions of 675 grams of carbon dioxide or equivalent per litre. A lightweight glass bottle, which is possible to get as well and people are moving towards, had 525 grams. A PET plastic bottle, 245 grams. An aluminium can, 190 grams. A wine pouch, 96 grams. And bag-in-box, 70 grams. So by this calculation, bag-in-box currently has not far off 10 times less impact in terms of carbon footprint than traditional glass.
Yeah, so where before alternative formats were novelties, often aimed at the very cheapest end of the market, we've all been there. Now they're being championed as having proper wine in them and the eco-friendly option to boot. But, can they take off in the big market? Sweden has over 60% of its wines in bag-in-boxes, apparently. France has roughly 38% of its supermarket sales in bag-in-box. Didn't know that. But the UK apparently is only around 2 to 5% bag-in-box.
We're way
wine
behind,
sales.
aren't we?
Yeah.
Way
So,
behind.
that has grown apparently over lockdown, which is interesting. And it would be interesting to tease out the reasons for that. But, the big question is, will wine drinkers really forsake or forego glass bottles?
I mean, sometimes glass, it's the only thing that'll do, isn't it? Really? For sparkling wine, for example, because of the pressure, or for wines that need long aging. I mean, alternative formats still don't have anywhere near the shelf life of glass because they're not totally inert or impermeable. But even so, it does seem as if the winds of change are blowing. A recent study by UK-based WRAP reported that 63% of UK consumers want businesses to take immediate action to tackle climate change, and 29% think food and drink businesses are behind other countries.
Yeah, so we wanted to hear the views of the Transformers, or the Alt Pack, as we'll call them.
Love
various
these names.
different
We
names.
need a competition to find the best name for this gang of people.
Yeah, come on, send us in your ideas.
Some ideas.
Anyway, it's WTAF. In the meantime, they were doing a tasting to coincide with COP26, so I was packed off
In a bag-in-box?
In a bag, wasn't in a bag-in-box. Felt a bit like it. I think you were busy with far more important things.
I was.
Anyway,
I was packing. Packing you.
First up, we're going to hear from Rob Malin, who's CEO of When in Rome, a specialist in alternative formats from bag-in-boxes to cans, flat bottles, and paper bottles. Rob had actually just got back from speaking at COP26 as a representative of the wine industry, and this was what he had to say about that.
Well, the funny thing is that I was with a lot of representatives of industries that have a huge image problem. There was, believe it or not, an oil and gas company on the panel that believes it's part of the solution to slowing global warming. I come from an industry, I think, that has an opposite image problem, because nobody would think of the wine industry as a villain in the climate story, and in fact we are. And so that was my point. I was there to say, actually, I would like our industry to be the subject of more scrutiny, because nobody is scrutinising our industry at all. It's a completely under the radar and should be scrutinised.
In what way?
Well, there's just a lot we can do to reduce our climate impact. I mean, the wine industry's total global emissions are about 20% of that of aviation, right? So, in aviation, everybody would think that's part of the problem, right, and not part of the solution. The wine industry is 20% of aviation. So let's just say that that's not nothing. We have a lot to play in reducing our carbon footprint.
Tell us about your work with Carbon Cloud, because that's really, really interesting.
So Carbon Cloud is a very groovy Swedish startup, and they worked with Oli, the oat milk brand, to calculate their overall carbon footprint of each. So when you buy Oatly in the supermarket, it has the carbon footprint on it. We came to them actually and said, look, will you help us do the same? And so we've started to add the carbon labelling to our products. They have a very clever algorithm. You give them all the inputs that your producer is using to produce his wine. You basically draw your supply chain out on a map for them and hand it to them. And then they just go, and here is the carbon footprint of your products on the shelf in the UK supermarket. It's a big undertaking for our business and has raised questions that we absolutely hadn't foreseen. But, the lesson we've learned from it is that you just have to be honest with your consumer about the number. I mean, firstly, because no one has a clue what that number should be anyway. Because you've got to start somewhere, right? So you just put a number on your box, and then your emissions have to reduce.
Do you think this sort of labelling of climate impact of a product should be mandatory? It should be something that everyone's doing?
So, I would love to see it as mandatory. We don't believe in net zero necessarily. There's an obvious climate impact to the activity of our business. Right? So what we're just going to say, we come straight to the consumer and go, look, here is the climate impact of our business. We're doing all we can to minimise it. And by the way, here is the climate impact of other things. We did a study that if you were to put Neradavola from Sicily on your cornflakes instead of locally produced dairy milk, as in milk from a cow, it was 50% carbon saving.
There's a thought. Neradavola on our cornflakes. When we can.
Terrible problem. Good for the environment.
So net zero may not exist in wine, but how do you see? What are the most pressing things for wine to address to become more sustainable, to really, become a leader in the issue of sustainability?
And that's the thing. It wouldn't be that hard. It wouldn't be hard. The wine industry is a low margin business, right? It means it will respond to financial incentives or disincentives very, very quickly. Like we can't afford. It's not the oil and gas industry that can afford to keep paying damages to people when they spill oil everywhere. It's not like that. We don't have deep pockets. So if there was a carbon tax, everybody's behaviour was to change overnight. And if there was a carbon tax is a radical proposal, but like carbon labelling, like we're starting to do, would be a very, very easy way of differentiating between, a good producer and bad.
Maybe that's the way forward. Yeah. Rob, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So I find his work with Carbon Cloud fascinating, and I love the idea of transparency about climate impact on labelling. I love the attitude of you've got to start somewhere, put a number on it, then work to reduce it. But to be honest, I'm still slightly perturbed by the thought of wine as a villain.
Yeah,
I don't like that.
It is quite shocking, isn't it?
It's not nice.
I suppose that's probably the point, though, and
yeah.
I suppose it's all about sort of being clear-eyed about the impact that businesses have on the planet, and wine among them. Nothing has no impact. But, I think we'll hear a bit more about this in our interview with Rap towards the end. So I think let's say hold that thought, wine as a villain, for the moment. We're not quite done with it just yet.
Okay, well, one thought I probably won't be holding is Neradavola on my cornflakes.
That was an interesting one, wasn't it?
Really? I can drink wine at most times of the day, but the thought, no. And anyway, as for mandatory labelling and carbon taxes, that's also quite hard to hear for the wine world, but maybe it will end up being necessary.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing wine needs is extra costs and bureaucracy, but it is certainly an interesting one. And I think it's also something we'll be touching on again in a moment. So, yeah. In the meantime, I wanted to bring in Oli Lee from the Bib Wine Company, who put proper wine in boxes and also pouches for tastings. Now, Oli is one of the founder members of WTAF. So I started by asking him, WTAF?
We chose the name, obviously with the understanding of what it often means. And I think partly because we feel that there's a message that should be being heard that isn't. So it's actually a nice, appropriate double meaning for us. But it stands in our case for wine traders for alternative formats.
So what's the message that's not being heard?
The move away from glass bottles to alternative formats is by far the biggest leap we can make. And that message, I don't think, is necessarily being heard or spread as widely as it could. When you look into the details, it's really important. It's a huge difference. If we were to move away from glass bottles in the UK alone, we could save 750 million kilos of CO2 equivalent emissions, which is massive. It's the same as...
Is that per year?
Per year in the UK. So that's the equivalent of taking 350,000 cars off the road. And that's just in the UK. So, we want to put forward the positive aspects of alternative formats. We want to work with people that also bottle wines. And we're certainly not out to upset anyone. But at the same time, I think it's important we realise where the wine industry has a problem with carbon footprint and not sort of fudge around the edges too much.
Just let's start with what you do, your bib, your bag-in-box. So just explain really, really briefly and simply how your technology works. What's in your bag-in-box?
So the box is cardboard, recycled content and recyclable. Inside that, there's a bag attached to which there is a tap. And the bag is multi-layered plastic. It's 100% recyclable. Essentially, that multi-layer plastic technology is designed to keep the wine in good condition for as long as possible. And that's the name of the game. The other really interesting aspect, which is important for having this wine at home, is the tap. So the bag collapses as the wine pours out of the tap. The tap's designed not to let air back in, and the bag can collapse in on itself. And this means you're not introducing more oxygen to the wine. And so you can open it and then not worry about it.
But talking about plastic,
yeah.
People do get worried about plastic.
Yes.
And obviously you use plastic for the bag.
Yeah.
And people worry about plastic because it pollutes, a potential pollutant for land, sea, air. They also worry about other things, potential contaminants, hormone disruptors, whatever it is. How are you addressing those concerns?
But I think on the last point, it's really important. We work very closely with our suppliers. All of our plastics are contaminant free in terms of the main known contaminants. In terms of how plastic's seen, I think it's really important to say that what this plastic allows us to do here is to reduce the carbon footprint by 10 times, which is massive. In the light of COP26, we're all focused at the moment on how we reduce carbon footprint, how we save ourselves from, it's not even an impending climate crisis, it's a here and now climate crisis. And so the most urgent thing we have to do is to reduce carbon footprint. But that's not to say that we're happy to leave it there. We've worked closely with other people in the industry, and we teamed up with a company called Enval, and they've got some really cool technology. It's a new type of pyrolysis technology, which is similar to thermal cracking. What they do is they take our bags and taps, all of it, and they take our pouches as well. We have sample pouches and their caps, so pretty much anything we have. And they use this carbon-induced pyrolysis process. What that means is they crush carbon into the materials and then fire electricity through it to produce temperature. And they can control it very easily and to a very sort of minute degree of accuracy. And that allows them to create new feedstock oils. So they break down those plastics into feedstock oils that can be used to make brand new packaging. Food grade, food safe. It's not recycling as we know it. It actually is a completely, in terms of plastics, it's a completely closed loop system. And it's completely repeatable.
So that's feedstock, foodstock?
Feedstock, yeah, they're called feedstock oils. So if you imagine you're making...
to make new plastics.
Yeah, exactly. It can become new lycra, it can become new whatever it might be. And in fact, they have the ability to turn the temperature up and down. I'm simplifying a little. It's partly my understanding of their processes. But they have the ability to control it, to change which polymers they're creating, reducing it to, so that they can provide what's required for the industry at the time.
But presumably that process involves quite a lot of energy input as well.
That's the really interesting thing. It always has done. So thermal cracking, chemical recycling, pyrolysis has always been a bit of a sort of almost pie in the sky. It's possible, but it's energy intensive up until this carbon-induced version, because it takes a tiny amount of electricity to get the temperatures right up, and that's what's really quite new about it.
And what's the take-up rate of on this scheme? Because there's obviously one thing being recyclable, another thing being recycled, and I'm aware that not everyone is necessarily as perfect as they would like to be in this. What's your feel for the take-up rate of people sending? Because you ask people to send you these back in, the plastic elements back into you.
It's hard to measure so far because we only launched this in February, March this year. If you imagine these bags take 7 to 10 bag-in-box liners and tabs, that's the equivalent of 30 bottles of wine. Not everyone gets through 30 bottles of wine in that time. But I think where we can measure it more safely is with our taster boxes. So we do little taster boxes, 6 samples, 100ml samples, and they come in pouches. And those pouches, again, need recycling. They sort of fall into the hard to recycle bracket, and their caps. So we send a free post envelope out with those, and we've so far had a return rate of over 83%. Which is huge and, I think a really good sign. And we hope to be able to push up the bag-in-box side to get close to that element as well. And I think the last point on that is the aim of doing all of this work and creating this system with us and Enval and all of Enval's other partners is almost a proof of concept so that Enval can then take those plants and get them into local authorities. Because what local authorities won't do is take a gamble, and the national government won't push them in any particular direction. They're quite bad at that. There's no unified recycling system here. So if you imagine in the 90s where you had bottle banks, and we're all driving our bottles to the bottle bank, and now they're all being collected. So I think it's really to have that proof of concept before the local councils can pick it up. We move that way.
So you would like to, in short, be part of something to show this can be done and actually get it rolled out nationally to a curbside type at-home pickup for plastics, which could then be recycled very efficiently.
Exactly. And plastics are picked up much wider in other countries. So it's a bit shameful that A, it's not the same for every council, and B, we don't collect more of types of plastic.
Oli Lee, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Fascinating to hear about their plastic regeneration process with Enval and carbon-induced pyrolysis. I can't even say it. Carbon-induced pyrolysis. I certainly couldn't say it after a bag-in-box, could I? I mean, properly recycling plastics is surely one of the key challenges we need to address alongside carbon emissions. So that sounds really positive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it would be great if schemes that could operate on a curbside basis.
Yeah, it'd be amazing. Yeah, we absolutely need to deal with plastics properly. But I think the key thing is that Bib's scheme does need people to be proactive, though, to separate the cardboard from the bag in the first place after you've finished it, then pop the bag in the envelope and then put it in the post to send it back in.
Yeah, I mean, but think about it. We've gone from thinking, I don't want to take my own bags to the supermarket, I'll never remember them. We do it automatically now.
We can and should, absolutely.
It is more difficult than just grabbing a plastic bag at the end of your shopping. But actually, it's not that complicated.
We all need to get our heads around it. We all need to contribute. We're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution. I agree. But, at the same time, you need people to buy into these things.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then the plastic just goes to landfill. So hopefully their indicative take-up rate that he cited from the pouches recycling will be the same for bagging boxes. But I guess we'll just have to see.
Now, one point we mentioned earlier was quality. It's important not to forget that wine quality is everything here, because we can talk about sustainability till the cows come home, but ultimately we want to drink decent wine. So that has to underpin everything, doesn't it?
Totally. So we're going to be recommending a couple of alt format wines later. But one thing that's good to say right now is that, I think what's exciting about this new generation of transformers, as I'm calling them, is that wine. I like transformers too. Wine quality is right at the top of the list of their priorities. That's crucial, and it's brilliant. I think these are pretty posh wines going into new packages. So at the tasting, I had a delicious Spanish orange wine from Bagnum, and a lovely funky Bordeaux from Bag-in-Box. I was working hard while you were doing your busy stuff.
I love the idea of Spanish orange from Bagnum.
And actually, it'd been in the Bagnum for quite a while, and it was absolutely delicious.
Because orange wines they don't always stay stable, do they? I mean, that's quite a risk.
Well, I don't know. I think they might be more stable than other wines. Actually, it's a good point. Depends how much
sulfur's in them. But
actually, it seems, I reckon it could suit the format. But anyway, both of these wines were from More Wine, a specialist importer. I asked owner Rich Hamblin if it was hard persuading people that good wine could come out of alternative formats.
Bag-in-box wine has moved a long way since days of Stales of Chelsea on tap in your local boozer, and thankfully technology has moved on. So the bag is far better. The tap on the bag is far better. I think in the 70s they were both prone to leaking a lot of air and hence oxygen into the wine and causing a lot of wine to spoil. And a lot of people just didn't understand that it had spoiled, and so hence were drinking terribly out of condition wine. So that's all been tightened up.
And you, as far as I understand, you work with TerraCycle, is that right?
Yes, correct.
Can you explain just how that process works?
We win, I think, by importing bag-in-box wine because there's far, far less weight. The packaging arrives at the winery flat packed as opposed to shipping empty glass bottles to the winery. But the end consumer needs to get rid of the waste. So the cardboard, very easy, flat packed, off to the recycling. The plastic is tricky. So the plastic can be complex. It can be a hard element with a tap. And the bag itself can be complex. It could be an aluminium layer. So a lot of councils don't readily recycle this. So that means that we work with TerraCycle and we collect back from consumers, from trade customers, the empty bags. And then we send them on to TerraCycle, who rework them into usable plastic. Not perfect, but in the grand scheme of things, far, far better than it ending up in landfill.
Not perfect in the sense of that plastic isn't perfect when it's sort of recycled. It can't be used for everything.
Well, not perfect in that it involves the consumer or the trade consumer engaging with us and wanting to be involved.
It's sort of trying to get a sense of the overview, isn't it, really? It's not just about carbon emissions. There's a whole picture to take into account here. How are people going to change? How are you going to help people to change? Wine consumers, wine lovers, like most of us.
Yeah, well, it's changing. So just continuing to work hard, continuing to try and find the very best wines that we can in these alternative packaged goods,
yes,
so that people are actually drinking something they want to drink and not just for the sake of a sustainability tick.
And what would you say to people who just like the feel and experience of their bottle, of their wine in a bottle?
I decant my bib wine into a lovely bottle.
Fantastic! So hang on, so you got a bottle in hand. Which
yes.
So you reuse that. So you put your bag-in-box, you
yes.
you literally put it into a bottle and
it encourages restraint as well, which is no bad thing.
Does it? Okay.
Yes.
Well, yes. I like the idea that you're going beyond the bottle and the whole bag-in-box could be at risk. But what a lovely idea! Why not? Fantastic, Rich. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
That's a genius hack.
Isn't it?
Why have we not thought of that before? I mean. It's just a no-brainer, isn't it? God, I feel really stupid not having thought of it.
We are very slow.
Yeah, I mean, you pour your bag-in-box into a nice bottle, which is reusable. Yeah. I mean, you could even, if you wanted to, kind of push a cork into it. And,
you could.
Hey, presto, you've got the real deal.
Yeah, you got a nice feel on the table to pour out for your guests.
Yeah. I mean, it's...
Rich. Genius, Rich. So it's just so simple. Save the planet, drink deliciously. I think it was also interesting to learn a bit about TerraCycle, wasn't it? And More Wine, touching on what we discussed earlier, they actually offer a cash rebate, a cash incentive to send the plastics back in, which is, I think, very helpful.
It's certainly helpful in initial stages,
I think so.
To encourage people, yeah.
Now, talking of cash savings, I also spoke to Nick Darlington of Graft Wine, which is going big on key kegs.
Key kegs.
Tell us more. I know. I had to learn about it as well. Key kegs is the brand name, but it's essentially a 20-litre, I think, bag in a plastic keg, and you attach it to pipes and serve it on draft. I think the best way is maybe if I put a picture of it up on the show notes on our website, susieandpeter.com, of what it looks like. And then
presumably they're for bars and restaurants, or people who just drink a lot of wine.
Yeah, no, they are for if you've got a draft set up at home, great, and you have lots of friends over. But no, I mean, they are, absolutely, they're for bars, restaurants. They're also for independent merchants who either have a bar or drink on site, or they do refills. If you remember,
we need more of that, don't we?
Yeah. No, Paula van den Easter, didn't it, from our episode on how to buy wine, talked about having that as well.
Yeah.
But anyway, you fill a glass or bottle up from the keg, And then at the end, it's light and recyclable rather than being cleaned out with harsh chemicals and carted around like the metal kegs we see, for breweries and other things.
And does that mean they come with a cost saving?
Yes, so I did
cheaper?
ask Nick about cost and quality because in the past, bigger formats haven't always been associated with quality.
I think in the past, the bigger players who were doing this, and I won't name names, but some of the biggest distributors have been doing this for actually quite a while, and they were using it as something to put out the cheapest of wines. I mean, the really cheapest of wines, the sort of things you would find in big pub chains at bottom house wine kind of level. Anything we have in keg is either from a winemaker we already work with on bottles, or even if we don't, we would anyway if we needed to. So it's the same quality level, but crucially, you are finding a cost saving of between 10 and 30% on the wine, the same wine that's in the keg as we have in the bottle. And that depends on the distribution network that the winemaker might have for accessing the kegs, how efficient they are, all sorts of things. But ultimately, the saving is good. So as we go through this, I think, inflationary period for hospitality, for suppliers to hospitality, particularly at the bottom end, it's going to be harder and harder to provide wines, good wines, at that £5 to £10 per glass out of bottle. But we've got a lot more breathing space to do that with key keg because those savings are built in.
So you also, as part of your business, most of what you do is bottled wine. So it's not just a question of saying bottles are out, alternative formats are everything. How do you see the future for wine and for wine bottles?
They're still there. I mean, you're right. It's wine on tap is about 10% of our business. I can't see, we're not going to phase out bottles entirely. And actually, I wouldn't want to. But I do think that from our side of the industry, where you're supplying the premium on trade with great wines from around the world, you do not necessarily need to be getting those wines by the glass sub £10 out of bottle. I'd like to see us going gradually, or maybe faster than gradually, over the next 5 years or so, over the next decade, to a point where the default option for those first 4 or 5 wines you have on your wine list by the glass to come out of a key keg. And the vast majority of other wines we will still have in bottle because that's the sector of the market we work with, and it works well for that. But for the high turnover wines, it's not necessary.
Nick Tyson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So we might expect our house wines to come out of kegs in the future, or even other wines, and maybe cost a bit less.
Yeah, well, that's the key thing, isn't it? A cost saving 10 to 30% sounds pretty welcome, I think. Isn't it? Now,
Win-win.
the kegs do look a bit strange, sorry, but, this is a brave new world. Though on that note, we haven't yet really touched on cans, have we?
No.
So maybe this is the moment to bring in Oli Purnell of the Copper Crew, a wine startup focused on quality South African wines out of a can. So I asked him, why cans?
We think cans are a good thing for anything out and about, anything that certain old trade venues where space is a real problem. And we also think that it's a really good thing, and maybe it's the most powerful element of it actually, is moderation. So cans, our cans are 250ml. Once you have the can, that's it. And a lot of people we know, the moderation part was really important because people would sort of regrettably finish off a bottle. And we think cans have a good answer to that. So that's really why cans.
Just to touch on aluminium itself, obviously people worry about things like aluminium, as they do about things like plastic. Of course, it can be recycled, and as far as I understand, the recycling rate is pretty decent, about 70%. But obviously, the aluminium mining itself does come at an environmental cost: bauxite, electricity, water. How do you tackle that concern?
Absolutely right. Again, one thing with sustainability in wine and alt formats, there's no silver bullet, and that wasn't an aluminium pun. What I think it's about is looking at it and trying to do the best you can with what we have and starting somewhere. And with aluminium, as you've illustrated, there is a big downside that you have to extract something out of the ground to make them work. The big thing with cans, though, is that this idea of infinite recyclability. So once you produce it and it's there, you lose no amount of the material every time you recycle it. So therefore, you don't need to extract more. And there are a lot of cans in circulation. So our cans could be a can of beans from the 1960s, quite possible. And that's really the most important thing about cans and why they're sensible. But I'm absolutely agree with you that they are not the perfect solution. And also, again, with formats, a lot of attention is paid to, cans are good, Bag-in-box is great, paper bottles, and agreed. But you've got to look at sustainability holistically. So that also means how you're producing the wine, how you're shipping the wine, how you send it out to customers, etc. It really is a massive process. And that's the way that we try to think about it. And you have to start somewhere rather than, I think, as much as I would like to have all the answers, alas, I don't.
And I think you're right. I think a lot of drinkers would say the same thing. They want to do the right thing. They want to be sustainable, but at the moment it's quite difficult making sense of what is a very big and quite complex picture of, yes, on carbon emissions on the one hand, but then it's not just about carbon, it's about methane and other gases, but then it's also about plastic pollution and so many different things in the piece across a supply chain, and that's just wine, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Water usage as well. So that there are so many things to take into account. Do you think there's any hope of achieving some sort of a comprehensible system of auditing and displaying this kind of information to customers, to wine drinkers?
My personal belief on this is that the only way to really make the change happen is regulation. That's what I believe. I think taxation and regulation are the way to really, really start change. But in terms of things that wineries can do and it's something that we would very much like to do, is it's starting on something like becoming a B Corp, where you are effectively audited on many of those things, and you do have to move to a point of continuous improvement. And that, I think, is the right way to approach things. But then, as we've already touched on, wine is such a price-sensitive market. So anything you do which is more expensive, unless you can convince people to pay for it, then it's not going to move. So it's a very difficult chicken and egg, which I totally understand for most producers to be in. But I think if we're going to take it seriously, and we have to take it seriously, because the reality is, if we don't do something, well, you can forget a lot of your nice wine-producing regions, because the climate in 20, 30 years' time will mean that they can't produce what they want to produce. So I would like to think that it's in self-interest, but ultimately I think it has to come from regulation.
What would you say to people who just like the feel and experience of drinking their wine out of a glass bottle?
Totally get it. And this is something that people often think I'm on a sort of mad crusade to end all bottles, full stop. No. Bottles clearly have their place, and there's a ritual behind opening a bottle of wine, particularly if you're sharing it with somebody. There's an important part of that. And I don't think alt formats are here to replace bottles. But what I think they are here to do is everyday drinking. I think that is where they have power to replace and significantly reduce carbon footprint, rather than saying a bottle shouldn't exist.
Oli, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
If we don't take it seriously, you can forget your nice wine-producing regions. That is punching. Crikey.
Yeah, no, really interesting if you're here. And I think fair enough, he's got a point. You know, like Rob, I think he's a believer in regulation and taxation as the ways to drive change. But in the meantime, just trying to start somewhere, make a positive difference. He's a very positive guy, actually.
He is very positive, and I don't want to be negative, but I guess I'm going to be. But I mean, isn't there talk about quality issues with cans?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I did talk to him about it, but we didn't have time to put it in here. But just to summarize, you know, every format has quality issues. You know, glass with cork wine or reduction. Plastic isn't a perfect barrier. It can allow oxygen to permeate and oxidize the wine eventually if it's not really good. You know, with cans, there have been issues reported with reduction, haven't there? Or the formation of hydrogen sulfide, which just smells like sort of stinky eggs. That's
not pleasant.
It's not very nice. It can happen in bottles, but it is, you know, in cans, it's been identified as a problem in up to 20% of cans in one study that I've read, some research, a thesis.
It's quite a lot, isn't it?
So that's quite a big number. I mean, I have to say that we haven't really found it to be that high. Generally, the cans we've had have been decent. The reason that the hydrogen sulfide forms is because some forms of sulfur, which is used as a natural preservative in wine, the free sulfur can react with the aluminium if it permeates the liner that's on the inside of the can. So that can be an issue. But I did ask Oli about that, and he said they hadn't had problems. It's manageable if you're on top of it. You just need to make the right wine in the right way and put the right kind of wine in the can. If you're on top of that, it shouldn't be a problem. And they haven't had major issues. So. And
what about shelf life?
It's another really good question. I asked most people about shelf life, actually. Now, it did seem that most of these alternative formats don't have long shelf life. They just don't, you know.
They're not made. No, it's not the point.
Exactly. If you want your wine to age for a long time, you put it in bottles. The point about these is you don't have shelf life because wine is acidic, it's corrosive, it's reactive. You know, bottles are okay because they're completely inert and impermeable. But plastics, cans, they're not. They will end up failing at some stage. The key is to just get through the wines as quickly as possible. Most people
it's
said
not a problem.
It was fine. It was just a question of effective stock management. These wines are made to be drunk young, so get them through, tell people to drink them, and that's great. And so there is apparently minimal wastage in that sense. And as specifically regards to cans, Oli said, interestingly, that initially their manufacturer wouldn't give them any assurances about shelf life, so he described it as a high-risk strategy to start that business.
Good on them for doing it, though, anyway.
I know, exactly. But now, interestingly, they give 24 months as a period with no perceptible change of the wine.
I mean, interesting too that Oli touched on moderation. That does seem to be quite a common theme among the alt format guys, trying to encourage moderate consumption and also minimal wastage, as we just talked about. And I mean, don't the Copper Crew cite some interesting wastage stats?
Yeah, they do. They point to a study by Laithwaite, which apparently found that the average British household throws away 2 glasses of wine a week.
What? Who are you? We'll come round and finish it off. Don't throw it away.
But apparently
Lord.
that works out as just over 17 bottles annually per household, or 624 million bottles all told wasted. So a quarter of those people said they opened more than they wanted to drink. The point being that cans are smaller format, so you can control your wastage better and be more moderate.
So finally, we wanted to get an independent perspective on all of this, didn't we?
Yeah, that's right. So I talked to Adam Herriot at WRAP, a charity that looks at resource management and making sure packaging is sustainable and preventing waste. Now, he described glass as a fantastic material, endlessly recyclable and reusable. He said glass was becoming more energy efficient, and both lightweighting of glass bottles and bulk shipping and bottling in destination were really helping. But he also said glass is heavy, and so transporting it comes at an environmental cost. I then asked him about plastic.
Plastic isn't an evil thing. It's how we treat it once we're done with it. It doesn't litter itself. We litter it, unfortunately. So it's the way we're saving the Plastics Pact. We're making sure that any plastic that is used it is necessary. It isn't just something that's there for show or just to make it slightly easier, so multi-pack things, for example, but also making sure it's designed and use the right materials, and using materials that can be recycled. So rather than having like a plastic bag or a pouch that is sort of got different lots of layers and laminates, got foil in there, moving to make sure it's a mono material, so a single type of plastic, which can be easily recycled, rather than having to try and remove foil off and different layers, which we just can't do, and it's not economical to do. Technically it's not even possible to do a lot of the time. So making sure that people think about that part of it as well.
Can plastic be, or PET, PET, can it be infinitely recycled?
That's a very good question. Technically, no, it can't. So the more times you recycle plastic, it will start to degrade or lose its sort of properties and the strength. However, it's not actually that big a problem. So if you think like a plastic bottle, it's got higher recycled content in there, but you're unlikely to ever get 100% recycled content in all packaging. So you're always introducing new plastic in there, which effectively nullifies that problem. But also that's just only really applicable as well if it's recycled through traditional means, so mechanical recycling. Which is effectively sort of what you generally think of, so, wash it, shred it, melt it, form it into a new product. But there's also non-mechanical recycling, or sometimes known as chemical recycling, which effectively breaks down the polymer into their monomers, then build it back up into effectively a brand new plastic again, which stops that degradation. It's a brand new plastic, but it's recycled content. So, and that's developing more and more. Again, that's becoming more common now. We're starting to get plants in the UK that are doing that. So yes, in plastic, in theory, technically can't be recycled infinitely, but it's not actually a problem when there are technologies out there that are helping sort that problem and solve that challenge. What about cans? Yeah, again, much like glass, aluminium, metal, it's infinitely recyclable. It doesn't lose its quality over time, unless it's made out of material that rusts away. Obviously, that's slightly different. But again, it's very, very intensive to recycle metal. It takes, obviously, to smelt new cans and new tins and whatnot. It takes a lot of energy. You have to heat that up really, really high. So it's a great material. It does fantastic stuff, and it's certainly a place on the shelves for people to buy their things. I wouldn't say it is a from the environmental side of things, I don't think we should swap things like, say, water bottles for aluminium cans. It makes no sense at all from an environmental side of things. I think you're much better off looking at actually plastic is lighter, it's cheaper, it's less intensive to produce and recycle, and we're very good at collecting and recycling it. So again, I don't think it should be something. It's necessarily something we should just switch to. It needs to be really carefully considered of why we might want to switch and what the impact of that might be as a result of that.
All right, thank you, Adam. Just one final question for you. One CEO of a wine brand said to me that wine is a villain in the climate story. Would you agree with that?
I guess sometimes it can be the villain, but I think in general we need to tackle everything. We can't just say we can't blame it on one thing. If it's a problem, if it's a problem with wine in terms of what we're moving around the globe, it's a problem for other products too. And I think we need to tackle everything, not just focus on one particular product.
Adam, thank you very much indeed for your time.
No problem at all.
So wine isn't necessarily the villain in the climate story. I mean, it's a bigger picture, but we do all need to do our bit, wine included.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair way of looking at it. As long as everyone is measuring, managing and reducing their impact, this is the best way forward. The blame game doesn't really help.
So when he talked about chemical recycling, that was the same as what we discussed with Oli Lee at the Bib Wine Company when he talked about Enval's pyrolysis.
Yeah, exactly. What Adam said was that in his view, a combination of mechanical recycling, the traditional, normal, and chemical recycling, this slightly newer one, was the best way forward for plastics.
And there might be a role for labelling and tax too.
Yeah, like Adam said, plastic isn't evil. Nothing here is inherently wrong. It's what we do with it, how we use it, how we recycle it, how will this impact the environment is what matters. I think it's about having an awareness we need to take serious action. Whether that involves labelling and tax too, maybe, but just then trying to do our best to figure out what combination of things is going to work best.
So there we go. Quite a lot to process there. To make it a bit more digestible, we've actually put some wine tips on our show notes, including the best wine we've ever tasted out of a can.
Oh, that was something.
It really was. Plus a variety of other things, including wines from those people we featured in the show.
Yeah, now it's been said in the programme, but of course, wine's climate impact goes well beyond packaging, to the vineyard, winery, transport, loads of stuff. We did touch on this in our episode entitled Extinction Regeneration Wine, which is actually back in Series 1, episode 27. And no doubt we'll come back to it again soon because this is such an important issue.
In the meantime, thanks to all our interviewees, Rob Malin of When in Rome, Oli Lee of the Bib Wine Company, Rich Hamblin of More Wine, Nick Darlington of Graft Wine, Oli Purnell of the Copper Crew and Adam Herriot of Wrap. Do tune in next time when we're chewing the cud with none other than living wine legend Oz Clarke. But in the meantime, thanks for listening and cheers.